Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars video. This is going to be my review for both The Mandalorian Season 3 Episode 1 and also The Bad Batch Season 2 Episode 11. So, it's this, from a content kind of creation point of view, when Star Wars isn't the focus of my channel in completion, I don't want to be doing two Star Wars videos a week right next to each other. I do want to leave space for, to be open for when Avatar stuff does actually happen. So, yeah, it's not ideal, but for at least these first couple of weeks, while there's a crossover of the two shows, I will have to do both reviews at the same time. So I'm going to do the Mandalorian review first. I'll have a timestamp in the description and stuff like that if you want to get straight to the Bad Batch review. Somewhere like roughly halfway through the video. But anyway, The Mandalorian is, I think, going to have a lot of the excitement because it is the kind of premiere of Season 3. And it is, it's such a well-regarded show in terms of a lot of people saying, quote unquote, saved Star Wars after kind of what happened with the sequels and the movies not really being a thing with Star Wars anymore, and us waiting for, I think, April at the Star Wars Celebration, where hopefully they'll finally clarify, what their plan is for Star Wars movies going forward. But right now, Star Wars is shows, TV shows, and what really led the way was The Mandalorian. So this show is very, very important to a lot of people in terms of kind of more modern kind of Star Wars fandom, and it is finally back for Season 3. Now, to be fair, you could say that we did have a bit of a season 2.5 with quite a bit of the Book of Boba Fett being focused on Din and Grogu and Luke and stuff like that. So, that's the first thing to, I suppose, get across, is that you have to have watched those episodes. If you just go straight from end of Season 2 into Season 3, you are going to be asking a lot of questions. And in many ways, I kind of feel like, is that why I don't feel like incredibly strongly about this episode, this premiere? It felt very reintroduction-y for everything. And I get it, it's been, 2 years since the last season. It has been quite a wait for a full-on just Mandalorian episode. This is fine as an intro. I think it's still a good episode. I enjoyed it start to finish. It's just, I think, like a lot of people, you maybe just expect a little bit more from your big show like this, The Mandalorian, to just start off on a little bit of a bigger foot. Now, ultimately, we are going to get into Mandalore stuff. The setup is all here. We know that that's going to be the case. But I also understand when some people are saying, is this the plot? Is this what we're doing here? This is the plot of this season. Din wants to redeem himself because he took his helmet off. And look, I get it. They've set up the whole culture of the Mandalorians. You don't take your helmet off really well. They really double down on this with the kind of opening scene with a young kind of Death Watch style Mandalorian joining and putting on his helmet to effectively never take it off again. So that's fine, and that works. People get it from a character perspective why this is what is driving him. But in the same episode, they're very much pointing out once again, like with the Bo-Katan scene, that this is just one aspect of a specific kind of path of Mandalorian culture. Many of them don't do things that way, and in fact have kind of cultural aspects that are more focused on, say, like the Darksaber, which is something Din doesn't seem to focus on too much, because that doesn't seem to be maybe as much of a focus in his side of things. But for Bo, that's the kind of only thing that she can really talk about. And maybe there's a little bit of a contrast there of, her calling what he is in a cult, when, what she follows also has kind of cult-like aspects by itself. Like, what does it say about the other Mandalorians that they will only follow someone if they hold that lightsaber? And maybe that's what they're kind of trying to get into. Like, what is Mandalore going forward? What are the Mandalorians going forward? Will they always be separate? Are we trying to kind of reunite them under some new goal? How will we go about resolving a lot of this stuff? That's what I think we ultimately want to get into. But that's what they did here. So the start of that quest of like, he has ultimately decided he's going to go there. He wants to redeem himself. Again, the specifics are that he wants to go to what the mines of Mandalore. He gets the more specific exact location. But there's all this talk about, okay, the Empire basically bombed the place and it effectively is nothing like it was in the past. The mines, they think, are gone. And effectively the idea is almost that the planet is kind of cursed or poisoned because it's been so badly affected. Like, the environment has been so affected. Can you even do anything there? And is the method to even redeem yourself even available to Din? And he's going to go ahead with that, while at the same time seemingly wanting to try and prove something to Bo, that, like, you know, Mandalore is important and what's going on here. And there's also that point as well, is that the culture exists outside the planet. So it's not that the planet is like the be-all, end-all, but of course it is the home planet. And how much of that is a very, very important thing for, say, like Din, who, outside of just being a Mandalorian, doesn't seem to inherently have a connection to that planet because he's not from there. And there's all that sort of stuff that's I think important to get into. Similarly, the Darksaber stuff, you wonder, will they bring that up again in terms of who will challenge him for it and all this sort of stuff. The other side of things is that we do go back to Navarro, and so we meet Greef Karga again, and we see that actually quite a lot has changed. This is probably the biggest sense for, like, oh, time has passed here. This place has evolved and is much more... what way do they word it? Like, they're going about things in a more legal way here. It's less sort of shady, almost kind of like being run by kind of like gangsters and backstreet deals, and it's much more like official now is probably the word to say it. He calls himself the High Magistrate, but he still wants to emphasize the fact that he doesn't want New Republic oversight. There's a fun moment in here where they do clarify that, like, oh, Cara Dune, they finally address why she's not been in anything. And they just say that, you know, she was, like, signed up by, Special Forces. So that's why she's not around anymore. And he wants a sheriff in place. Someone who can keep the law here, a lawman, but someone who isn't just, you know, allied with the New Republic. He wants to still keep things sort of like independent, but you know, no New Republic oversight, and that's fine. But what we get here is that, okay, he's here, he actually sees the statue of IG-11, and he realizes, oh, I actually would like IG-11 sort of repaired, because it would be really helpful, especially if I go to Mandalore and it's poisoned. The droid would be really helpful to get through this, and clearly, despite his dislike of droids, he has formed some sort of an attachment to that droid. So he tries to repair him on his own, and it's revealed that the parts that are left over can actually be reactivated, but it's to his older programming as just the assassination droid, programmed to kill basically Grogu. They bring it to I forget the species name, but, you know, Babu Freak, basically, a bunch of them in the droid repair shop, and they're told there that what's the situation here? The memory kind of chip is fried. They can repair the kind of robotics of the droid, but the memory chip is gone. But they're saying that if you get a new memory chip for this specific model of droid, then it can actually work in some way. So this is another one of Din's quests, is that he wants to restore IG-11 and utilize him going forward. How do I feel about this? Ultimately, it's one of those things where, like, IG-11 was cool while he was in the show. I don't feel any particular need necessarily to bring the character back as such, because, like, I don't think, like, it's that important of a character, but maybe from sort of a kind of business, you know, marketing kind of perspective, they want this specific droid back in some sort of a maybe unique repaired way. It's going to sell some action figures. It keeps, it creates more of a set kind of plot and group of characters in the show, when otherwise it's sort of, most of the time it's Din, Grogu, and then occasional appearances from some of the other members of the cast. I understand maybe that's more of the decision here. But again, it's just, okay, cool, droid companion, IG-11's cool, but I don't care like that much. So hopefully that plot doesn't take like too much time. It's sort of a cool, but there's other stuff I would like to get the focus on. I think the best parts of this episode are definitely just the stuff with all the other Mandalorians. Like you have the armor, what Paz Vizsla as well, and what it's his, is it his son or something like that? I think is almost like the implication is the one who is getting his helmet for the first time. So you see the armor, make the helmet, paint it, and you have the sort of like oath of this kind of Death Watch style Mandalorian, where, he makes the kind of pledge, I will not take this helmet off. But just as he's about to finish it, an attack comes, because he's standing in the water when they do this, and an attack comes in from a giant creature, and there's a big, big battle going on here. Now, it's interesting that the Bad Batch episode, which I'll talk about in a second, also has a big giant creature in it, and this one also has it. Look, there is a little bit of a trope in Star Wars that is not the one I'm the biggest fan of, and that is just you have a reasonably big creature, blasters are effectively useless on it, and you can't do anything about it until some sort of a ship comes in, or you maybe get a lightsaber involved. That I wasn't a big fan of, because I wish they would just clarify that, like, okay, a couple of blaster shots are not just going to kill this giant creature, but they should be doing a bit more damage to it, rather than just treating the creature as being invulnerable. Because then it makes, when you do stuff like, say, the Zillo Beast, which actually has sort of specific, like, genetic kind of things with its skin and stuff like that, that actually make it, like, properly, basically invulnerable to blaster fire. It makes that feel less important when just, like, a giant crocodile type thing with scales is, like, just as effective for some reason. And it's just one of those things you note from a consistency standpoint across the series. This is something that does tend to happen quite a lot, and you'd almost feel a little bit better about it if they just were a bit like more reasonable about it. That, like, yeah, he like Paz Vizsla opening fire on him with like a chain blaster, Gatling blaster. That should be hurting it a little bit more, but you're not seeing the effects of that necessarily. Again, it's cool to have a giant crocodile monster just defeat all these Mandalorians, and the idea seems to be that they're probably going to lose this fight, that maybe they have to full on do a retreat and bring in the more kind of heavy artillery, but they're going to lose a lot of people before that happens, and it's only Din arriving in with his starfighter that actually wins the day. Pretty cool kind of final shot, but again, it sort of highlights that, like, oh, only big guns can harm this. And it's just a little bit of an annoying thing. But again, we do get the sort of reiteration from the armor, like, you are not a Mandalorian anymore because you took your helmet off. And he wants to redeem himself still. And that's really kind of about it. And that's the kind of almost thing with this episode, is that there's not, in my mind, actually that much to talk about with the episode. Like, okay, we get to the Bo-Katan scene at the end. She has a Mandalorian castle in one of the other one of the other planets in the kind of Mandalorian system. But she basically doesn't have anyone else with her, it seems. Like, they have all abandoned her since she doesn't have the Darksaber. And she just talks about how they are basically mercenaries off doing their own thing. And she is clearly in some sort of a kind of like depressed, kind of lost state, that she initially had this plan to retake Mandalore, but it has all gone kind of wrong, and she has lost hope and faith that this is actually something that can happen. And so what are they going to do here? What's going to be her turnaround, I think, as a character? And this is where you wonder, like, in terms of, like, eventually when we get there, what's going to happen? Does this mean that Din is going to go to Mandalore on his own? something will happen with whatever he finds out the planet is habitable to a certain degree. It's not maybe poisonous or as poisonous as expected. Stuff can be done here. He returns to her to give the kind of positive news. Is that what just reinvigorates her, or is there something kind of more going on here? And you sort of wonder, like, if he told this information to the Armorers group, like, do they particularly care much about Mandalore at this point either? Because I think Bo even says that, like, you know, your group was technically the first to almost like abandon Mandalore, and they've never particularly cared about it. So, do they care at all? That's the kind of big point in this. Din has got to the point where he does, to a certain extent. So, that's just an interesting one by itself. Probably the only other scene is probably the hyperspace scene where you do get to the Purgle reveal in hyperspace, which is a nice reference to, you know, stuff we found out about in Star Wars Rebels. And you had maybe a little bit of a kind of Force connection almost kind of type thing with Grogu and the Purgle. That was actually nice to get ultimately. But yeah, just a very like solid episode of The Mandalorian, but nothing, I think, super special for the premiere. Of course, got to watch the next episode, and I think we will get to better moments. Like I said at the start, I think this was just a little bit more of a reintroduction episode, given that it's been a little bit since Season 2, and even Book of Boba Fett. It's been a little bit since we saw these characters, so that's fine, ultimately. Now, let's move over. Let's talk about the Bad Batch. This is Season 2, Episode 11 here. So we get an interesting episode that initially comes across in some ways as if, oh, is this just another one of these kind of filler type episodes again? Like the kind of pirate episode where we got unlocked the secret relics on the planet and we got the giant kind of thing. And it seems to be that. But then they make some really, really strong connections back to the Clone Wars. They're talking about sort of the whole more broader plot about sort of why the Empire has actually chosen to wipe out Kamino. And it's not just about the clone troops. That cloning itself is much more of the actual focus in all of this. And this is beginning to bring this episode into play in terms of it being a more plot-focused episode. So I thought this was definitely an above-average episode for the Bad Batch. You know, would you say this is a full-on plot episode? Maybe not quite, but it's pretty close to it. And you wonder, like, is this going to lead to other stuff happening? Or is it just more of a one-off kind of reference to other stuff? But it's a nice episode, definitely. Zillo Beast connection after all of this time. Like, that's Season 2 episode of the Clone Wars? So it's from a very long time ago. And it was just this open plot point of Palpatine wanted that thing researched after it was dealt with. And you knew that he was going to do something with it because even Palpatine views that beast as being an incredibly, incredibly powerful creature. And you see that in play here, even though it's a kind of younger, smaller one. Just how, if allowed to go out of control, this quickly does become a near unstoppable threat. And sure, once again, for the most part, this was not an amazingly strong Bad Batch character focus episode. At the very least, they viewed this as being significant enough information that Hunter wanted this reported directly to Echo and Rex. So that might bring the Bad Batch back into play, and that was something that was, I think, relatively nicely done. Omega is sort of being brought back into play in terms of more of a, is there a reveal about the character, which is something I've been waiting for quite a while. And right at the end, that kind of final line of dialogue almost, I was wondering, it's just like, you know, the girl, like, she's the key to all of this. And I was waiting for the next line. Is it because there's something specific to the way, like, Omega is like a unique clone, that she would unlock the Empire's, like, potential in cloning beyond everything? But no, they actually more went just down the idea of, Nala Se is connected to Omega, and that is her weakness. So if you can use Omega against her, you can get us to work with you, because that's the kind of reveal in the broader scope of things, is that the Empire want to do cloning stuff themselves. They want to take the Kaminoans out of the picture as being the ones that more or less control cloning, but they don't have the expertise to do it, and they need the likes of Nala Se as like an expert on this to help them. But she is refusing to do that now after what's happened in previous episodes of The Bad Batch. And now the Prime Minister, who's also revealed to have survived all of this, is being brought in, and he just reveals that, yes, if you use Omega against Nala Se, that's potentially how you can get her to work for you. So, for the most part, the thing that maybe makes the overall episode not feel as strong is just that they're kind of leaning almost into the direction with the Zillo Beast, that this is just a way to sort of utilize its genetics to make, like blaster-proof armor or something like that. That seems to be more of the kind of takeaway from everything revealed within the episode. Rather than necessarily any particular cloning thing. But I think it's more of the idea that, like, if the Empire could somehow control Zillo Beasts and they could manage to control them, then they effectively do have an unstoppable army. Because as we see, like, it's that specific kind of, like, energy laser is, like, the only thing that seems to be able to take it down. And obviously the Empire went in here and were able to take this thing down, capture it no problem, because they knew that this was serious business, that they needed to go in all guns blazing to take it down. As we see, the Bad Batch were incredibly ineffective against the Zillo Beast. They couldn't do anything against it, even in its much, much, much smaller form, let alone when it became, like, nearly mature. So, interesting stuff. I still wonder what exactly the end goal of all of this particularly is, because I think the thing that everyone is trying to get at is, like, in a way, Bad Batch Mandalorian connection ahead of, like, the sequels, is that seems to be what the setup is that the Empire gets into cloning, and the reason they're investigating cloning so much is that they eventually want to find a way to do the whole Palpatine cloning vagueness from the sequel trilogy. And if there's a good enough explanation, that could really help that stuff from the sequels, which maybe wasn't as well received. So that's what we're, I think, trying to get to, which again is where, like, the almost like the Omega connection kind of comes in, of just like, is there something more that makes her special? And this is where, we're ultimately trying to get to the idea of, can you use a cloned body to use the Force, which I think has always been this thing in Star Wars that, like, would almost, like, it would break Star Wars if you were allowed to clone a Force sensitive person and they keep their Force powers. That would be a kind of crazy plan if that was the way it actually worked. So obviously we know from the sequels that it eventually works to a certain degree, which is kind of what Snoke is, and the whole Palpatine clone. But what are the specifics on how they actually got there? Is it something about the sort of, like, energy growing aspect of the Zillo Beast? Is Omega an example of them finding a way to maybe somehow make someone Force sensitive? Is that going to be something that happens with her? Those are some of the kind of, I think, bigger theories that people have about what's going on here. Because otherwise, the situation is, if there's nothing particularly important about Omega in that sense, then it's just a case of, the series has its simple plot of just the Bad Batch trying to protect Omega, which works to a certain extent, but we want to see something bigger happen also. So there's that. We got to see quite a lot of clone commandos in this episode. They were, like, the entire focus of everything that was kind of going on here. There was a bit of a kind of Empire style moment where just the planet, the kind of town where the Zillo Beast attacked, they just took in all those people for what seemed like no reason whatsoever. And is it just because they saw the Zillo Beast that they want to hide this, and that's why they took everyone in? But it's a real sense of, that's the Empire asserting their dominance, where they didn't really need to. Like, could they not have just taken the Zillo Beast and left? Why did they have to land and go after all the people? That's a little bit of a confusing thing, and I'm assuming it is to keep this ultimate cloning project of this crazy important animal a secret to some degree. So I wonder kind of what exactly we're doing here. Because, you know, it seems kind of crazy, but like, are we trying to get to some sort of thing in the Bad Batch where we have like multiple clones of the Zillo Beasts attacking somewhere or another, and then the Bad Batch have to help out in some way? And you sort of wonder, connecting a lot of stuff together, well, if they could get the giant ancient kind of Colossus robot thing that fires some sort of an energy beam, would that thing be able to take down a Zillo Beast? That would be a pretty crazy fight if, you know, that ancient piece of technology fought this legendary monster. That would be kind of cool. But seems like a lot of work to get to that point. And it's not, is it even in line with what we're trying to do with the Bad Batch as a series? I don't even know. But there is some fun stuff going on in the series here. Like, you know, just seeing, even though this was like a different avenue of the Empire, in that like we weren't dealing with crosshairs here, Rampart or anything like that. It was just, this is the Empire on the cloning side of things. And I think it's stuff like, you know, Nala Se saying like, I know exactly what Emperor Palpatine is trying to do with this cloning technology, but I'm not going to help with it. Very ominous things. So there's still potential. Like, we've got, what, 5 more episodes of the Bad Batch left here. I'm wondering what they're going to do. Like, it still, I think, does ultimately remain a little bit of a frustration, is that we still don't really know what the trajectory is for the Bad Batch, and we're getting into the final batch of episodes. Even in this episode, we had the scene with Sid, where I like that they confronted her. They were annoyed that she ultimately didn't send any help for them, and she's just like, hey, you got yourself out of this situation. I'll give you a better percentage on this deal if you go ahead with it. Go ahead with it. But even when they ended that communication, I liked that Tech, I think, was the one to mention, like, yeah, we probably do need to kind of break things off with her, but we need to do it in a, like, diplomatic way. So let's do this and, you know, in a nice way, break away from her. So he's thinking about that, and I think that needs to happen. I think it probably should have happened much earlier on in the season. Will they do anything more with it? I'm not really sure, ultimately. There's that. So yeah. And then overall, I suppose, final thoughts, covering sort of like both episodes. I suppose I never talked about the pirates from the Mandalorian episode, but there's not too much to say about them. They were introduced to allow Grief Karga to show how impressive he is, how impressive the Mandalorian is. I did like the space battle. I thought that was actually kind of cool, highlighting just how impressive that starfighter is, the Naboo starfighter that he has, is that he can just zip through asteroids that have holes in them while they're struggling to go around the outside, and he just took them off one by one. So that was nice. Is that leading to something that we're going to have a confrontation with the Pirate King? I don't really know. Is that an important plot point? Who knows? But, you know, it was just something to be there. Like I said, it felt very introductory. Here's how impressive the Mandalorian is as a fighter. Don't forget that Grief Karga is a good shot. You know, little things like that. So yeah, I felt both episodes were good in their own way. But it's probably an example of the Mandalorian episode maybe wasn't as good as expected. And the Bad Batch episode this time out was actually a little bit better than expected. So interesting kind of grouping here. But yeah, we'll have the same thing next week and onwards until the Bad Batch comes to an end, which leaves, what, the last 3-4 episodes of the Mandalorian to air on their own, which should make things easier for me at the very least. I do wish they had sort of changed the Bad Batch's schedule so that they either doubled up on some of the episodes a little bit more, or else started the airing a bit earlier so there was less overlap. You know, what, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, I suppose, ultimately, of having to do like 2 reviews is a little bit much. But I wonder how it will do. Like, will this improve the ratings of both shows? The view count on both shows, will it hinder them? Maybe it's a little bit of a test to see if they do a larger overlap, if that works out well for them. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the 2 episodes. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on the season 3 premiere of the Mandalorian and episode 11 of season 2 of the Bad Batch. Let me know what you think about them below. But that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.